Margaret stood very still, trying to keep her breathing steady. The Apache man sat on his horse, looking at her with dark eyes that showed no anger or threat. She had heard terrible stories about Apache warriors since coming to Arizona. People in Tucson talked about raids and killings and how you could not trust any of them. But this man had just said he meant no harm, and he had said it in English, which surprised her. She found her voice, even though it shook a little when she spoke. She said, "I did not know anyone was close enough to hear me." The man climbed down from his horse, but he stayed at a distance. He moved slowly, like he did not want to scare her. Up close, she could see that he was maybe 30 years old, with a strong face and scars on his arms that probably came from fighting or hunting. He wore clothes made of hide and cloth, and he had a rifle and a knife, but his hands were not near either weapon. He said these lands carry sound in ways that surprise people. He pointed up at the ridges around the valley. He said, "I was up there and your song came to me on the wind." She relaxed just a little bit. There was something calm about the way he spoke. She said, "Do you live near here?" He shook his head and said, "My people move with the seasons. We do not stay in one place like you do. We have camps in the mountains and in the valleys. We go where the water is and where the game is." Margaret looked back at her bread cooking on the stones. She was afraid it might burn if she did not tend it, but she was also afraid to turn her back on this man, even though he seemed peaceful. He noticed her glance and said, "Please take care of your bread. I will stand here and not move." She decided to trust him, at least for this moment. She knelt down and turned the bread rounds over so they would cook evenly on both sides. The smell of baking bread filled the air and her stomach growled again. The man said, "You live here alone?" It was not really a question, but Margaret answered anyway. She said, "Yes, I do. My husband died 3 years ago, and I wanted to be somewhere quiet." He seemed to think about this. He said, "It is dangerous for a woman alone. There are not just Apache in these lands. There are also bad men from your own people who would harm you." Margaret knew this was true. She had bought a shotgun before leaving Tucson, and she kept it loaded inside the cabin. But she also knew that a gun would not save her from everything. She said, "I filed papers in Tucson. This land is mine by law." The man made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not quite. He said, "Papers. Your people love papers. But the land does not know about papers. This land belonged to my people for more years than anyone can count. Then your people came with papers and guns and said it was yours now." Margaret felt her face get hot. She knew he was right, but she did not know what to say. She had not taken this land by force. She had simply found a place where nobody else was, and she had filed a claim like the law said she should. She said, "I know that my people have done terrible things to yours. I cannot change that. But I am just one person trying to live quietly. I do not want to hurt anyone or take more than I need." The man studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been watching you for 2 months." Margaret's eyes went wide. 2 months. He had been watching her all this time, and she had never known. He continued speaking. He said, "You take only water from the stream and you leave plenty for the animals. You do not cut down trees unless they are already dead. You do not shoot at every creature you see. You are different from most of the whites who come here." Margaret did not know if she should feel afraid that he had been watching, or grateful that he seemed to approve of how she lived. She said, "What is your name?" He hesitated, like he was deciding whether to tell her. Then he said, "I am called Dakota. It means friend to everyone, though I have not been much of a friend to your people." She said, "My name is Margaret Hayes." It was a strange moment. Here they were, 2 people who should have been enemies, standing in the morning sun, introducing themselves like neighbors. Dakota said, "Why do you hum that song?" Margaret thought about it. She said, "My grandmother taught it to me when I was small. I do not even remember all the words anymore, but the tune stayed with me. I hum it when I am doing work that my grandmother taught me, like making bread." Dakota nodded slowly. He said, "My mother sang songs while she worked too. She sang while grinding corn and while making clothes and while cooking." He paused and his face became sad. He said she was killed by soldiers 5 years ago. She had done nothing wrong, but she was Apache, and that was enough reason for them. Margaret felt a wave of sorrow for this man. She said, "I am sorry. No one should lose their mother that way." Dakota looked at her and seemed surprised by her sympathy. He said, "Your people do not usually care when Apache die." Margaret said, "I care. I have lost people I love too, and I know that pain. It does not matter what color your skin is or where you were born. Pain is pain and loss is loss." The bread was done now. Margaret used a cloth to pick up the hot rounds and set them on a wooden board to cool. The smell was even stronger now, and she saw Dakota look at the bread with interest. She made a decision that was probably foolish but felt right. She tore one of the rounds in half and held out the larger piece to him. She said, "Would you like some? It is still hot." Dakota looked at the offered bread like it was the most surprising thing he had ever seen. For a long moment he did not move. Margaret wondered if maybe offering food was an insult in his culture. But then he stepped forward and took the bread from her hand. He said thank you. He bit into it carefully and his eyes showed that he liked the taste. He said, "This is good." "What do you put in it?" Margaret said, "Just flour and water and salt." "My grandmother said the best things are simple things." They stood there eating bread together as the sun climbed higher in the sky. It was one of the strangest mornings of Margaret's life, but also somehow one of the most peaceful. Here was a man who should have been her enemy sharing her food and talking with her like a human being. Here was proof that maybe not everything she had been told about Apache people was true. When they finished eating, Dakota said, "I should go. If I stay too long, my people will wonder where I am." Margaret said, "Will you come back?" He looked at her carefully. He said, "Would you want me to come back?" She surprised herself by saying, "Yes, I would. It is lonely out here, and you are the first person in months who has talked to me like I am a real person, and not just a crazy woman." Dakota almost smiled. He said, "I will come back, but you must be careful. Do not tell anyone in Tucson that you have seen me. Do not tell them that we talked. Your people would not understand and they might try to hurt you or use you to find my camp." Margaret said, "I will not tell anyone. This will be between us." The morning sun was just coming up over the red rocks when Margaret Hayes started making her bread outside the cabin. She had been living alone in this Arizona valley for almost 6 months now, and she liked the quiet. The cabin was small, but it was hers, and that was all that mattered to her. She knelt down beside the fire pit she had built with her own hands and started kneading the dough on a flat piece of wood. Her hands moved in steady circles, pushing and folding the soft mixture of flour and water and salt. It was peaceful work, and it made her think of her grandmother back in Pennsylvania, who had taught her how to make bread when she was just a little girl. Margaret started humming while she worked. It was an old song that she did not even remember the words to anymore, but the tune was still clear in her mind. The sound drifted out across the valley, mixing with the morning breeze that moved through the juniper trees. She did not know that anyone could hear her. She thought she was completely alone out here like she had been every day since she moved to this place. The nearest town was Tucson, and that was almost 20 miles away through rough desert country. She had chosen this spot because nobody else wanted it. There was no gold here and no silver, and the water was scarce. But Margaret did not need much. She had a small garden and a few chickens and a goat that gave her milk. She collected rainwater in barrels, and she knew how to make things last. Up on the ridge above the valley, a man sat on his horse watching her. His name was Dakota, and he was a scout for the Chiricahua Apache. He had been riding patrol through this area, checking for soldiers or settlers who might cause trouble for his people. When he first heard the humming, he had stopped his horse immediately. His hand went to the rifle that lay across his lap, but he did not pick it up. Instead, he just sat there listening. The sound was strange to him. Most of the white people who came to this land brought noise with them. They brought wagons that creaked and guns that fired and voices that shouted. But this woman was making a different kind of sound. It was soft, and it reminded him of the songs his mother used to sing when he was young. Dakota watched as Margaret worked with the bread dough. He could see that she was alone. There were no other horses tied up near the cabin and no smoke from other fires. This was unusual. White women did not usually live alone in the desert. They came with husbands or fathers or brothers who carried guns and built fences and claimed the land as theirs. But this woman seemed different. She had built only a small cabin and a small garden. She was not tearing up the earth looking for gold. She was not damming up the streams or cutting down all the trees. She was just living quietly, making her bread and humming her song. Margaret shaped the dough into 4 round pieces and set them on hot stones near the fire. The heat would cook them slowly, and by midday she would have fresh bread to eat. She kept humming as she worked, and she did not notice the man on the ridge above. She was thinking about how good it felt to be away from the crowded towns where everyone wanted to know your business. After her husband Daniel had died in the mine collapse 3 years ago, she had tried to stay in Tucson. But everywhere she went, people looked at her with pity or they tried to tell her what she should do. Some said she should go back east to her family. Others said she should remarry quickly before she got too old. Nobody seemed to understand that she just wanted to be left alone with her grief and her thoughts. Dakota knew he should ride on. He had other areas to scout, and staying in one place too long was dangerous. But something kept him there on the ridge. He watched as the woman checked her bread and added more small sticks to the fire. He watched as she stood up and stretched her back and looked out across the valley with a peaceful expression on her face. There was something about her that reminded him of his own people. The Apache had lived on this land for generations. They knew how to take only what they needed, and how to move with the seasons, and how to respect the desert that gave them life. This woman seemed to understand those things too, even though she was white. Margaret went into her cabin and came back out with a clay jar of water. She drank some and then poured a little on her hands to wash off the flour. The bread was cooking well and the smell made her stomach growl. She had not eaten since yesterday evening, and she was looking forward to having fresh, warm bread with some goat cheese she had made. Simple food, but it was good, and it was hers. She sat down on a wooden stool near the fire and went back to humming her song. The morning was getting warmer now, and she could hear the birds starting to wake up in the trees. A lizard ran across a rock near her feet, and she smiled at it. These small moments of peace were what she had come here to find. Dakota made a decision. He would go down and speak to this woman. It was a strange decision and maybe a dangerous one. His people were at war with the whites. There had been killings on both sides, and trust was a thing that no longer existed between the two groups. But Dakota had always been curious, and his name meant friend to everyone, even though he had not lived up to that name in recent years. He thought that maybe talking to this woman would help him understand why some whites were different from others. He started his horse down the slope, moving slowly so he would not startle her. His hands were away from his weapons. He did not want her to think he was attacking. Margaret heard the sound of hooves on sand, and her whole body went tight with fear. She stood up quickly and turned to see a man on a horse coming toward her. He was Apache. She could tell by his clothing and his long dark hair, and the way he sat on his horse. Her first thought was to run into the cabin and bar the door. But she knew that would not save her if he wanted to harm her. So instead, she just stood there with her heart beating fast and waited to see what would happen. The man stopped his horse about 20 feet away. He raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a greeting. Then he spoke in English that was slow but clear. He said, "I mean no harm, and your song carried far across the desert." Margaret woke up before dawn to the sound of horses. For a moment she thought maybe it was Dakota coming to check on her one more time. But then she heard voices speaking English, and she knew it was not him. She looked through a crack in the cabin wall and saw 3 soldiers sitting on their horses near her fire pit. Her heart started beating fast. One of them was looking at the cabin, and another was looking at her garden. The third one was younger, and he seemed nervous, like this was maybe his first patrol. The older soldier called out in a loud voice. He said, "Anyone in there, come out now. We are United States Army, and we need to ask you some questions." Margaret took a deep breath. She had done nothing wrong, and she had no reason to hide. She opened the door and stepped out into the gray light of early morning. The soldiers all turned to look at her. The older one who had spoken seemed surprised to see a woman. He said, "Ma'am, what are you doing out here alone? This area is not safe. There are hostiles in the region." Margaret said, "I live here. I have a legal claim filed in Tucson." The soldier looked around at her small cabin and garden. He said, "When did you last see any Apache?" Margaret's mouth went dry. She knew she could not tell them about Dakota. She said, "I have not seen anyone. I stay close to my cabin and mind my own business." The soldier did not look like he believed her. He said, "Ma'am, Apache scouts move through this whole area. It is hard to believe you have been here for months and never seen a single one." Margaret tried to keep her voice steady. She said, "Maybe they have seen me, but I have not seen them." The young soldier spoke up. He said, "Sir, there are fresh horse tracks over by those rocks. More than one horse." The older soldier's eyes got hard. He climbed down from his horse and walked over to look at the tracks. Margaret knew some of those tracks were from Dakota's visits. She felt panic rising in her throat. The soldier came back and stood close to her. He said, "Those tracks are fresh, probably from yesterday. Now I will ask you again, have you seen any Apache?" Margaret said, "I told you I have not. Maybe they passed through while I was inside." The soldier grabbed her arm, not hard enough to hurt but firm enough to scare her. He said, lying to the army is a serious crime, ma'am. If you are hiding information about hostile movements, you could be arrested. Margaret pulled her arm away. She said, I am not hiding anything. I am just a widow trying to live in peace. Let me be. The third soldier, who had not spoken yet, said, Captain, maybe she really does not know anything. Some of these women come out here to get away from civilization. They keep to themselves. The captain let go of Margaret's arm. He said, fine, but ma'am, you need to pack up and leave this area. There is going to be action against the Apache in the next few days. Any civilians in the area could get caught in the crossfire. Margaret said, I was already planning to leave today. I am going north to Flagstaff. The captain nodded. He said, that is smart. Get moving as soon as you can. If you see any Apache on your way, do not try to talk to them. Just ride fast and report it to the nearest army post. Margaret said, yes, sir. The soldiers got back on their horses. Before they left, the young one looked at her and said, good luck, ma'am. I hope you make it safe. Then they rode off toward the south, where the mountains rose up dark against the lightening sky. Margaret's hands were shaking as she went back into the cabin. That had been too close. If the soldiers had searched the cabin, they might have found things Dakota had given her. They might have found her journal with all the Apache words written in it. She finished packing quickly and loaded everything onto her old mare. By the time the sun was fully up, she was ready to go. She took one last look at the cabin and the garden she had worked so hard on. Then she turned her mare north and started the long ride to Flagstaff. The journey took 3 days because she had to go slow with the goat tied behind and the chickens in their crate strapped to the saddle. She saw smoke in the distance on the second day and heard what might have been gunfire, but it was too far away to be sure. She wondered if Dakota and his people were safe. She wondered if the young warriors who had raided that ranch regretted it now that soldiers were hunting them. She wondered if there would ever be peace in this land, or if the fighting would just go on until one side or the other was completely destroyed. When she finally reached Flagstaff, she was tired and dusty and hungry. The town was bigger than she expected, with a main street and several stores and a church with a white steeple. She found a boarding house run by a woman named Eliza Grant, who looked at Margaret with sharp eyes but seemed kind underneath. Margaret said, I need a room and I can pay. I also need to find work if there is any. Eliza said I could use help in the kitchen and with cleaning. Room and board plus a small wage. Margaret said, I will take it. That first night in the boarding house, Margaret lay in a real bed for the first time in months. It felt strange after sleeping on her straw mattress in the cabin. The sounds of the town drifted through the window. Voices and wagon wheels and a dog barking somewhere. She missed the quiet of the desert. She missed her little cabin. And she missed Dakota, even though she had only known him for a few weeks. She worried about him constantly. The work at the boarding house was hard, but it kept her busy. Eliza had 8 rooms that she rented out mostly to merchants and miners passing through. Margaret cooked meals and washed sheets and swept floors. The other woman working there was named Betty, and she talked constantly about everything and nothing. Margaret let her talk and did not say much herself. She did not want to make friends. She did not want people asking questions about where she came from or why she was here. One evening, about a week after Margaret arrived, a group of soldiers came to the boarding house for dinner. Margaret's heart jumped when she saw them, but they were different soldiers from the ones who had come to her cabin. They sat at the big table in the dining room and talked loudly about their work. Margaret served them stew and bread and tried not to listen. But she could not help hearing what they said. One soldier said, we got most of them rounded up. The ones who would not surrender, we tracked down. It was not pretty, but it had to be done. Another soldier said, I heard they are taking the survivors to a reservation up north. Families all split up. Children crying for their parents. Made me sick to watch. The first soldier said, well, that is what happens when they refuse to accept civilization. They had their chance to come in peacefully. Margaret's hands were shaking as she poured water into their cups. She wanted to scream at them that Apache people were human beings with families and feelings. She wanted to tell them about Dakota, and how he had been kind to her when he did not have to be, but she kept her mouth shut. Speaking up would not change anything. It would only make trouble for her. After the soldiers left, Eliza came into the kitchen where Margaret was washing dishes. She said, you look upset. Are you all right? Margaret said, I am fine. Just tired. Eliza studied her face. She said, those soldiers upset you, why? Margaret scrubbed a pot harder than necessary. She said, I just do not like hearing about people suffering. even if they are Apache, even if they are supposed to be our enemies. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my sister married a Cherokee man back east before they were forced to move. I know that the stories we tell about Indians being savages are not the whole truth. There are good and bad in every people. Margaret looked up at the older woman with surprise. Eliza said, but you need to be careful about saying things like that. Most people around here would call you a traitor for having sympathy for the Apache. Margaret said, I know. That is why I usually keep quiet. Eliza nodded. She said, smart. But if you ever need to talk to someone who will not judge, I am here. Margaret felt a small bit of the weight lift from her chest. She said, thank you. That means more than you know. 3 days passed before Dakota came back. Margaret had started to wonder if maybe he had decided it was too dangerous, or if maybe she had dreamed the whole thing. But then one evening, just as the sun was going down, she heard his horse and looked up to see him riding toward the cabin. This time she was not afraid. She stood up from where she had been pulling weeds in her garden and waved to him. He raised his hand in return and brought his horse to a stop near the fire pit. Margaret said, I was not sure you would come back. Dakota climbed down and said, I told you I would. I do not say things I do not mean. She smiled at that. She said, I wish more people were like that. She had a pot of stew cooking over the fire and she said, are you hungry? I made extra. He looked at the pot and then at her. He said, you knew I was coming. She shook her head. She said, no, but I have learned to make extra food just in case. When you live alone sometimes, you do not eat well, and having more means, I can eat again tomorrow without cooking. They sat by the fire, and Margaret ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls. The stew had rabbit in it that she had trapped and some wild onions and roots she had found. Dakota ate slowly and seemed to enjoy it. He said, you know how to find good plants. Many whites only eat what they bring with them, and they starve because they do not know the desert. Margaret said, I have been trying to learn. There is so much here if you know where to look. After they ate, Dakota said, I can show you more plants. There are some that help when you are sick, and some that keep bugs away, and some that taste good in cooking. Margaret's eyes lit up. She said, I would like that very much. I have a journal where I write down things I learn. Maybe I could draw the plants and you could tell me their names and what they do. Dakota seemed interested in this. He said, you make marks on paper that mean things. She said, yes, it is called writing. Do your people write? He said, no, we remember things and we tell them to our children. Our history lives in our words and our songs. Margaret said, I would like to hear some of your songs sometime if you would share them. Dakota looked at her like he was trying to figure her out. He said, you are strange for a white woman. Most of your people do not want to know anything about us, except how to kill us or move us away. Margaret felt sad hearing this. She said, I know. I am ashamed of what my people have done, but I cannot change them. I can only try to be different myself. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Dakota would visit every few days, sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the evening. He never stayed very long, but he always accepted whatever food Margaret offered. He began teaching her about the desert plants and animals. He showed her which cactus had fruit you could eat and which one would make you sick. He showed her how to find water by watching where birds flew at dawn. He showed her how to walk without leaving clear tracks in case she needed to hide from someone. Margaret wrote everything down in her journal and drew careful pictures of the plants. In return, Margaret taught Dakota about some of the things she knew. She showed him her books even though he could not read them. She explained about farming and how you could save seeds from one year to plant the next year. She taught him some English words he did not know, and he taught her a few words in Apache. They were building something between them that neither of them had expected. It was not quite friendship yet, because there was still too much history and too much danger, but it was moving in that direction. One day, Dakota brought her a gift. It was a small pouch made of soft leather with beads sewn into it in a beautiful pattern. He said, my sister made this. I told her I knew someone who might like it. I did not tell her you were white. Margaret held the pouch carefully. She said, it is beautiful. Please tell your sister thank you. She felt the weight of what this gift meant. Dakota had told his sister about her even if he had not told the whole truth. That meant she mattered to him at least a little. Margaret gave him gifts too. She gave him bread whenever she made it. She gave him a small knife that Daniel had owned. She gave him seeds from her garden so his people could plant them if they wanted. These small exchanges felt important, like they were building a bridge between two worlds that were supposed to be at war, but the outside world was not going to leave them alone forever. One morning, Dakota arrived earlier than usual, and his face was tight with worry. Margaret knew immediately that something was wrong. She said what happened. He said there has been trouble. Some young men from my tribe raided a ranch west of here. They killed 2 men and took horses. The rancher's family sent for soldiers. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She said, "Will there be fighting?" Dakota said yes. "The soldiers will come looking for us. They will not care if they find the men who did the raid or if they find women and children. They will just want to punish Apache people." Margaret said, "Where is your camp? Can you move before the soldiers find you?" Dakota said, "We are already moving. But moving is hard when you have elders and small children. We cannot move as fast as soldiers on horses." He looked at her and said, "You should go to Tucson for a while. If there is fighting, it might come close to here. I do not want you to be hurt." Margaret said, "What about you? Will you be safe?" He almost smiled. He said, "I have been in danger my whole life. This is nothing new." But Margaret could see that he was more worried than he was letting on. She said, "Dakota, you have been kind to me. You have taught me things and shared your knowledge. If there is any way I can help you or your people, I want to." He shook his head. He said, "There is nothing you can do. This is between my people and yours, and you are caught in the middle. The best thing you can do is stay out of the way." They stood there looking at each other, and Margaret felt a sadness that was hard to explain. In another time, or another place, they might have been real friends. They might have been able to sit by a fire and talk without worrying about soldiers or raids or all the hate between their peoples. But they lived in this time and this place, and those things could not be ignored. Dakota said, "I have to go. Please be careful." Margaret said, "You too. Promise me you will be careful." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I promise." He climbed on his horse and started to ride away. But then he stopped and turned back. He said, "Margaret Hayes, you are a good person. I am glad I heard your song that morning." Then he rode away fast, heading toward the mountains where his people were hiding. Margaret watched until he disappeared from sight. Then she went into her cabin and started gathering her things. She did not want to leave, but Dakota was right. If there was going to be fighting, she needed to be somewhere safer. She packed her clothes and her journal and some food. She caught her goat and tied it with a long rope. She rounded up her chickens and put them in a crate. It took her most of the day to get ready. She decided she would head north toward Flagstaff instead of back to Tucson. Dakota had mentioned once that Flagstaff was quieter and had fewer soldiers. That night she slept in the cabin one last time. She thought about all the peaceful mornings she had spent here making bread and tending her garden. She thought about Dakota riding up that first time and how scared she had been. She thought about how much things had changed since then. Tomorrow she would leave, and she did not know if she would ever come back. She did not know if she would ever see Dakota again. The thought made her chest feel tight and her eyes burn with tears she did not want to cry. 3 weeks passed in Flagstaff, and Margaret fell into a routine of work and sleep. She sent her goat to live with a farmer outside town who promised to give her milk and cheese in trade. She kept the chickens in a small coop behind the boarding house. Every morning she made bread for the guests, and every time she kneaded the dough she thought about that morning when Dakota had first heard her humming. It felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been a couple of months. One afternoon a man came to the boarding house asking for a room. He was not like the usual guests. He wore black clothes and a white collar, and he carried a worn Bible. Eliza said, "Father Donovan, it has been a while." The man smiled and said, "I've been out at the San Carlos reservation, trying to help those poor souls. The conditions there are terrible." Eliza showed him to a room, and he came down later for dinner. Margaret served him soup, and he thanked her kindly. He said, "You are new here. I have not seen you before." Margaret said, "I arrived a few weeks ago from down south. I needed work, and Mrs. Grant hired me." Father Donovan nodded. He said, "There are many people moving around these days. The Apache troubles have displaced a lot of folks." Margaret felt her chest tighten, but she just said, "Yes, sir, that is true." The priest ate slowly, like he was very tired. After dinner, he sat in the parlor reading his Bible. Margaret was cleaning up the dining room and she could hear him talking to another guest about the reservation. He said the army moved over 200 Apache people there last month. They took them from their homes in the mountains and marched them north. Many died on the way. The old ones and the sick ones could not keep up. Now they are crowded into an area too small with not enough food or clean water. The other guest said, well, that is what they get for being hostile. Father Donovan's voice became sharp. He said many of those people never raised a weapon against anyone. They were punished just for being Apache. That is not justice, that is cruelty. The other guest made a dismissive sound and said, I guess we will have to agree to disagree, Father. Then he went upstairs to his room. Margaret stood in the doorway to the parlor. She knew she should not speak, but the words came out anyway. She said, Father Donovan, do you know if all the Apache from the southern mountains were taken to that reservation? He looked up at her with tired eyes. He said, I believe so. Why do you ask? Margaret's voice shook a little. She said, I'm just curious. I heard there was fighting down there. The priest studied her face. He said, you know someone, do you not? An Apache person. Margaret wanted to deny it, but something about this man made her feel like she could trust him. She said, I knew one. He was kind to me when he did not have to be. I just want to know if he survived. Father Donovan gestured to a chair. He said, sit down, child. Tell me about it. Margaret sat and told him everything. About living alone at the cabin. About Dakota hearing her humming. About the bread they shared and the things they taught each other. About the soldiers who came and how she had to leave. About worrying every day that Dakota might be dead. When she finished talking, she felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Father Donovan listened without interrupting and without judging. He said, you did a brave thing befriending him. Most people would have been too afraid. Margaret said, I was afraid at first. But then I got to know him and he was just a person. A good person. Father Donovan said, I wish more people understood that. He thought for a moment. He said, I am going back to the reservation next week. I can ask around. The Apache who were brought there came from several different groups. If your friend is alive and if he is there, I might be able to find out. Margaret felt hope for the first time in weeks. She said, would you really do that? The priest said, of course. But you should know that even if he is alive, the conditions are very bad. The government does not care about these people. They want them out of the way so settlers can take the land. It is a disgrace. Margaret said, anything you can find out I would be grateful for. The next morning, Father Donovan left early to continue his journey. Margaret gave him a package of bread and cheese for his travels. He blessed her and said, I will send word when I return. It might be a month or more, but I will not forget. Margaret thanked him and watched as he rode away on his old brown horse. She felt like she had found an ally, even if he could not really change anything. The weeks crawled by slowly. Margaret worked and tried not to think too much. But at night she would lie in bed and remember sitting by the fire with Dakota. She remembered his stories about his mother and his people. She remembered how he laughed when she tried to say Apache words and got them wrong. She remembered the leather pouch his sister had made, and wondered if he had told his sister the truth before the soldiers came. She wondered if his sister was even alive. Betty noticed that Margaret seemed sad. She said, you have been looking like a storm cloud for weeks now. What is eating at you? Margaret said, I am just tired. Betty said, it is more than that. You can tell me. I am good at keeping secrets. But Margaret just shook her head. She said, there is nothing to tell. Betty looked disappointed, but she did not push. One day a new guest arrived at the boarding house. He was a soldier, but not the rough type. He was older, maybe 50, with gray in his hair and a quiet way about him. His name was Lieutenant Crawford. Eliza gave him the best room and he thanked her politely. At dinner that night he sat alone at a small table reading a newspaper. Margaret served him roast chicken and vegetables and he complimented the cooking. He said, this is much better than army food. You have a gift. Margaret said, thank you, sir. Crawford said, please call me John. I am off duty and I am tired of formality. Margaret smiled a little. She said, all right, John. He said, may I ask your name? She said, Margaret Hayes. He nodded. He said, pleased to meet you, Margaret. Where are you from originally? She said, Pennsylvania, but I have been in Arizona for a few years now. He said, it is a hard land. Beautiful but hard. They talked a little more and Margaret found herself liking this man. He was different from the other soldiers she had met. He did not brag about fighting Indians or talk about them like they were animals. Later she learned from Eliza that Crawford was being forced to retire because he had spoken out against the treatment of Apache prisoners. He had written letters to his superiors saying that the conditions on the reservations were inhumane. The army did not like that, so they were pushing him out. Margaret felt drawn to this man who had risked his career to stand up for what was right. One evening when he was sitting in the parlor, she brought him coffee and gathered her courage. She said, "Lieutenant Crawford, can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." She said, "Do you think there will ever be peace between whites and Indians?" He sighed deeply. He said, "I hope so, but I am not sure. Too much blood has been spilled. Too much hate has built up. But I believe that individuals can still find common ground even when their peoples cannot." Margaret said, "I believe that too." Crawford looked at her carefully. He said, "You speak like someone who has experienced this personally." Margaret hesitated, then said, "I knew an Apache man briefly. He was good and honorable. He saved my life by warning me of danger." Crawford nodded slowly. He said, "I have known Apache people who were better men than many whites I have served with. The problem is that institutions do not recognize individuals. The Army sees all Apache as enemies. The Apache see all whites as invaders. Both are partly right and partly wrong." Margaret said, "What happened to the Apache who were brought to San Carlos?" Crawford's face darkened. He said, "They are suffering. Not enough food. Disease spreading. Families separated. It is shameful. I wrote 3 reports about it and all 3 were ignored. That is why I am leaving the Army. I cannot be part of this anymore." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She said, "I am sorry." Crawford said, "Do not be sorry for me. Be sorry for them. They are the ones paying the price." That night Margaret could not sleep. She kept thinking about Dakota and wondering if he was at San Carlos suffering like Crawford described. She wondered if he thought about her, or if he regretted ever stopping to listen to her humming that morning. She got up and went to her small window. The stars were bright above Flagstaff and the air was cool. Somewhere out there under these same stars, Dakota might be looking up too, or he might be dead. She had no way of knowing. Father Donovan returned to Flagstaff 6 weeks after he had left. Margaret was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when she saw him riding up the street. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran to meet him. He climbed down from his horse slowly, like every bone in his body hurt. His face was thinner than before and his eyes looked haunted. Margaret said, "Father, did you find out anything?" He said, "Let me get inside and sit down. Then we will talk." In the parlor, Eliza brought coffee and the 3 of them sat together. Father Donovan drank his coffee like it was the best thing he had ever tasted. Then he looked at Margaret and said, "I asked about your friend. I talked to many people at the reservation. I described him as best I could from what you told me. An Apache scout named Dakota, about 30 years old with scars on his arms." Margaret held her breath. The priest said several people knew who I was talking about. "He is alive, Margaret. He is at San Carlos." Margaret felt her whole body sag with relief. She said, "Thank God. Is he all right? Is he hurt?" Father Donovan said he is not hurt physically, but the conditions there are breaking everyone's spirit. There is not enough food. People are sick with diseases they have no immunity to. The government promised supplies that never come. The Apache people are warriors and hunters, and they are being forced to farm land that will not grow anything. It is destroying them." Margaret said, "Can I see him? Can I go there?" Father Donovan shook his head. He said civilians are not allowed on the reservation without special permission. And even if you got permission, it would be dangerous for him if people knew you were friends. The whites would accuse him of being a spy. The Apache would accuse him of betraying his people. You would put him in more danger, not less. Margaret felt tears running down her face. She said, "So there is nothing I can do. He is alive, but I can never see him again." Eliza put her hand on Margaret's arm. She said, "Sometimes caring about someone means letting them go." Father Donovan said, "I did manage to speak with him briefly. I told him I knew someone who was worried about him. I did not say your name, but I described you as a woman who makes bread and hums while she works. He knew immediately who I meant. He asked me to tell you that he is surviving and that he thinks of you. He said the bread you shared was the best he ever tasted." Margaret covered her face with her hands and cried. She cried for Dakota and for all the Apache people suffering on that reservation. She cried for the friendship that could never be. She cried for the unfairness of a world that punished people for caring about each other across the lines that society had drawn. Eliza and Father Donovan sat with her quietly until the tears stopped. Over the next months, Margaret threw herself into her work. She cooked and cleaned and tried not to think about what might have been. Lieutenant Crawford stayed at the boarding house for several more weeks before leaving to visit his daughter back east. Before he left, he said, "Margaret, you have a good heart. Do not let this world make you bitter." She said, "I will try." He said, "If you ever need help, you can write to me." He gave her an address in Philadelphia. She thanked him, knowing she would probably never use it, but grateful anyway. Winter came to Flagstaff and the town got quieter. Fewer travelers meant fewer guests at the boarding house. Margaret had more free time and she used it to bake bread. She would make extra loaves and give them to people who needed them. A widow down the street with 6 children, an old man who lived alone and could barely walk, a young couple who had just arrived with nothing but hope. Eliza said, "You give away more than you sell." Margaret said, "Bread is meant to be shared." One cold January morning, a man came to the back door of the boarding house. He was Apache. Margaret knew right away, even though he wore white man's clothes and had cut his hair short. He looked around nervously like he expected soldiers to appear any moment. He said, "I am looking for the woman who makes bread." The woman who knew Dakota. Margaret's heart jumped. She said, "I am that woman. Come inside quickly before anyone sees you." In the kitchen with the door closed, the man said, "My name is Chado. I was with Dakota at San Carlos. He sent me to find you." Margaret said, "Is he all right?" "What happened?" Chado said, "Dakota is sick. There is disease at the reservation. Many have died. He has fever and cough, and the medicine from the army doctors does not help. He asked for you before he became too sick to speak. He said your name over and over." Margaret felt like the floor was falling away under her feet. She said, "I have to go to him." Chado shook his head. He said, "You cannot go to the reservation. They would arrest you." "But I escaped. I am heading south to Mexico, where some of our people are hiding. If you want to help Dakota, you must come with me. We can go to the reservation border and I can bring him to you if he is strong enough to travel. It is dangerous. We could be caught and killed, but it is the only way." Margaret did not hesitate. She said, "When do we leave?" Chado said, "Tonight. Meet me at the old mill north of town after dark. Bring warm clothes and food and any medicine you have. Do not tell anyone where you are going." Margaret said, "I will be there." After Chado left, she stood in the kitchen shaking. This was crazy. She could be killed or arrested. But Dakota had saved her life once. How could she not try to save his? She spent the day preparing in secret. She packed a bag with clothes and food and the few medicines she had. She took money she had been saving from her wages. She wrote a letter to Eliza saying she had to leave suddenly for family reasons and she was sorry. She knew Eliza would guess the truth, but she hoped the older woman would understand. That evening after dinner, Margaret went to her room like normal. Then when the house was quiet, she climbed out her window and walked quickly through the dark streets toward the mill. Chato was waiting with 2 horses. He said, "You came." "I was not sure you would." Margaret said, "Dakota is my friend. I could not leave him to die alone." They rode out of Flagstaff heading south. The night was cold and clear with a moon that lit their way. Margaret had never done anything this risky in her life. She thought about turning back a dozen times. But each time she remembered Dakota's face and his kindness, and she kept going. They rode for 3 days, stopping only to rest the horses and sleep a few hours. Chado knew the land and he kept them away from roads and settlements. On the 3rd night, they camped in a canyon near the reservation border. Chado said, "I will go in tomorrow and find Dakota. If he can walk, I will bring him here. If not, I will come back and tell you. You must stay hidden. If soldiers find you, tell them you are lost. Do not mention Dakota or me." Margaret said, "What if you do not come back?" Chado said, "Then you ride north and do not look back. You did what you could." Margaret barely slept that night. She kept the fire small and stayed in the shadows of the canyon walls. The stars overhead were the same stars that had shone on her cabin. She thought about that peaceful morning when she had been making bread and Dakota had heard her humming. That moment had changed both their lives. She did not regret it even now when everything had gone so wrong. Morning came and Chado left before dawn. Margaret waited. Hours passed slowly. She heated water for tea. She checked and rechecked the supplies she had brought. She prayed even though she was not sure anyone was listening. The sun moved across the sky. Afternoon came and still no sign of Chado. Margaret started to think he was not coming back. Maybe he had been caught. Maybe Dakota was already dead. Maybe this whole trip had been for nothing. Then as the sun was setting, she heard horses. She stood up, her heart pounding. 2 riders came into the canyon. One was Chado. The other was bent over his horse like he could barely stay upright. Margaret ran forward and saw it was Dakota. His face was thin and gray. His eyes were closed. His breathing rattled in his chest. Chato said he is very sick. I gave him medicine to make him strong enough to travel, but it is wearing off. We must work fast. They got Dakota down from the horse and laid him on blankets near the fire. His skin was burning hot and his breath came in short gasps. Margaret knelt beside him and said, Dakota, it is me. It is Margaret. Can you hear me? His eyes opened just a little and he looked at her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Margaret said, do not try to talk, just rest. I am here now. Chato said I must go back. If I am gone too long, they will know something is wrong. Already I have taken a big risk. Margaret said, how did you get him out? Chato said, I told the guards I was taking him to be buried. They think he is already dead. But when they check and find him missing, there will be trouble. You have maybe 2 days before they send soldiers looking. Margaret said, where should I take him? Chato said, there is a cave in the mountains west of here. I will draw you a map. It is hidden and there is water nearby. You can hide there until he is better or until he dies. The words hit Margaret hard. Until he dies. She said, I will not let him die. Chato looked at her with sad eyes. He said, you care about him very much. Margaret said, yes, I do. Chato nodded. He said, that is good. He needs someone who cares. He has lost so much. His mother. His sister. Most of his friends. He has been very alone. Margaret said his sister is dead. Chato said yes. She died on the march to the reservation. She was sick, and they would not let her stop to rest. She died on the side of the trail like an animal. Margaret felt rage and sorrow mixing together in her chest. She said, this is wrong. All of this is wrong. Chato said yes, but wrong things happen anyway. We cannot change the world. We can only try to save the people we love. He gave Margaret the map and some herbs that he said would help with fever. Then he mounted his horse. He said, good luck, Margaret Hayes. You are brave like an Apache woman. Dakota is lucky to have you as a friend. Then he rode away into the darkness. Margaret was alone with Dakota. She built up the fire and boiled water. She made tea from the herbs Chato had given her and tried to get Dakota to drink it. Most of it ran down his chin, but some went down his throat. She wet a cloth and put it on his forehead to cool the fever. She talked to him even though he could not answer. She told him about Flagstaff and the boarding house. She told him about Father Donovan and Lieutenant Crawford. She told him how much she had worried about him. The night was long and cold. Margaret wrapped Dakota in all the blankets they had and kept the fire going. Several times his breathing got so bad she thought he was dying. But each time he would gasp and start breathing again. By morning he was no better, but at least he was still alive. Margaret studied the map Chato had drawn. The cave was maybe 6 hours away through rough country. She did not know if Dakota could survive the journey. But staying here was dangerous. Soldiers could come at any time. She decided to wait one more day to let him rest. She made soup from dried meat and tried to get him to eat. He swallowed a little. His eyes opened more often now, and sometimes he seemed to recognize her. Once he whispered her name so quietly she almost missed it. She said, yes, I am here. You are safe. He closed his eyes again, but his hand moved until it found hers. She held it and felt tears on her face. That night she slept a little sitting up next to him. She woke to find him watching her in the firelight. His eyes were clearer than they had been. He said, Margaret. Why are you here? She said, because you are my friend and you needed help. He said, you should not have come. It is too dangerous. She said, you warned me when there was danger. I'm doing the same for you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am glad you came. I thought I would die without seeing you again. Margaret said, you are not going to die. I will not let you. Dakota smiled a little. He said, you are stubborn. She said, yes, I am. Now stop talking and rest. You need to save your strength. Tomorrow we are going to move you to a safer place. He said, where? She said, a cave in the mountains. Chato told me about it. Dakota said, Chato is a good man. He risked much to help me. Margaret said, I will thank him if I ever see him again. The next morning, Dakota was weak but able to sit up. Margaret helped him onto the horse and climbed up behind him. She held him steady as they rode slowly west, following the map. The journey was hard. Several times they had to stop because Dakota was too dizzy to stay upright. But finally, in the late afternoon, they found the cave. It was hidden behind rocks and bushes. Inside it was dry and there was space for a small fire. A stream ran nearby, just like Chato had said. Margaret made a bed from pine branches and blankets. She got Dakota settled and went to fetch water. When she came back, he was asleep. She sat at the cave entrance and looked out at the desert. The sun was setting and the rocks glowed red and orange. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Somewhere out there, soldiers were probably looking for them. Somewhere, Dakota's people were suffering on the reservation. But here in this cave, for this moment, they were safe. Over the next week, Dakota slowly got better. The fever broke and his breathing got easier. Margaret fed him soup and tea, and slowly he got stronger. They talked during the long days. He told her about his sister and how brave she had been even at the end. He told her about the reservation and the hunger and the hopelessness. He told her that many of the elders were giving up and just waiting to die because life there was worse than death. Margaret told him about her life in Flagstaff. She told him about Father Donovan and Lieutenant Crawford, and how both of them had tried to help in their own ways. She told him about Eliza, who had been kind even though she knew Margaret was hiding something. Dakota said, "You have good people around you. You are lucky." Margaret said, "I know, but I would give it all up to change what is happening to your people." Dakota said, "You cannot change it. The whites want this land and they will take it no matter what. My people are in the way, so they must be moved or destroyed. That is how it has always been." Margaret said, "But that does not make it right." Dakota said, "No, but right and wrong do not matter when one side has all the power." Margaret wanted to argue, but she knew he was correct. What could one person do against an army and a government that did not care? After 2 weeks, Dakota was strong enough to walk around. He said, "I need to make a decision. I can try to go back to the reservation and hope they do not kill me for escaping. Or I can try to reach Mexico, where Chato and others are hiding. Or I can try to live as a white man with a new name in a place where no one knows me. None of these choices are good." Margaret said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to go back to the time before any whites came to this land. I want my mother and sister to be alive. I want my people to be free. But I cannot have any of those things." Margaret said, "If you could choose only from the real choices, which would you pick?" Dakota thought for a long time. He said, "I think I will go to Mexico. At least there I can be with my own people, even if we are refugees. At least I will not have to bow to the soldiers who killed my family." Margaret felt her heart sink. She had known he could not stay, but hearing him say it made it real. She said, "When will you go?" He said, "Soon. Before the soldiers find this place. Before winter makes travel impossible." They had 3 more days together. They spent the time talking and sitting by the fire and not talking. On the last morning, Dakota said, "I need to tell you something." Margaret said, "What is it?" He said, "When I first heard you humming that morning, I almost rode away. I thought you were just another white woman taking land that was not yours. But something made me stop and listen. Your song reminded me that your people are human too. You are not all soldiers and thieves. Some of you are just trying to live like we are trying to live." He continued. He said, "Knowing you has made this time easier. When things were darkest at the reservation, I would think about the bread we shared and the things we talked about. I would remember that somewhere there was a person who saw me as a man and not as a savage or an enemy. That kept me alive, Margaret. You kept me alive." She said, "You did the same for me. You showed me that friendship is possible even when everything else says it should not be. You gave me hope." Dakota stood up and walked to his horse. Margaret followed. He said, "I do not know if we will ever see each other again. The world is too broken right now. But I will carry you in my memory. Wherever I go, I will remember the woman who made bread and hummed while she worked. The woman who shared her food with a stranger. The woman who risked everything to save a friend." Margaret could not speak. She just hugged him tight. He hugged her back. Then he climbed on his horse and rode away toward the south, toward Mexico, and a future that was uncertain but at least was his own choice. Margaret stayed in the cave for 1 more day after Dakota left. She needed time to think and to prepare herself for going back to Flagstaff. She knew there would be questions. She knew people might be suspicious about where she had gone. But she also knew she had to go back because she had nowhere else to go. That night she sat by the fire and thought about everything that had happened since that morning, when she had been making bread outside her cabin. So much had changed. She had changed. She was not the same woman who had just wanted to be left alone with her grief. The ride back to Flagstaff took 4 days because she went slowly and carefully. She did not want to run into any army patrols. When she finally reached the town, it was late afternoon. She went straight to the boarding house and found Eliza in the kitchen. The older woman looked up and her face showed relief and anger at the same time. She said, "Margaret Hayes, where have you been? I've been worried sick." The sheriff came asking questions. I told him I did not know anything which was true because your note said nothing useful. Margaret said, "I am sorry. I had to help someone." Eliza said, "The Apache man. The one Father Donovan told you about." Margaret nodded. Eliza shook her head. She said, "Girl, you could have been killed." Margaret said, "I know, but I had to try. He saved my life once. I owed him." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is he safe now?" Margaret said, "I hope so. He was heading to Mexico." Eliza said, "Good. Now we need to get our stories straight. If anyone asks, you went to visit a sick relative in Phoenix. You were there for 3 weeks. I will back you up." Margaret said, "Why would you lie for me?" Eliza said, "Because what you did was right, even if it was dangerous. Because this world needs more people who care about others even when it costs them something. Because I am old and tired and I do not have much power, but I can use what I have to protect people who deserve protecting." Margaret felt tears come to her eyes. She said, "Thank you." Eliza said, "Now, go get cleaned up. You look like you have been sleeping in a cave." Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. Margaret cooked and cleaned and made bread. She did not talk about where she had been. Most people accepted the story about the sick relative. A few looked at her with suspicion, but no one could prove anything. The sheriff came by once and asked questions, but Eliza sent him away saying Margaret had done nothing wrong. Lieutenant Crawford sent a letter from Philadelphia asking how she was. She wrote back saying she was fine and thanking him again for his kindness. Winter passed and spring came. Margaret started thinking about the future. She could not stay at the boarding house forever. She needed to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. One day Eliza said, "I have been thinking. I am getting too old to run this place by myself. Betty is nice, but she's not smart about business. You are smart and you work hard and the guests like you. How would you feel about becoming a partner? We could split the profits and when I die the place would be yours." Margaret was surprised. She said, "Are you serious?" Eliza said, "Completely serious. You have proven yourself. You are honest and capable and you care about people. Those are the qualities I need in a partner." Margaret said, "Yes. Yes, I would like that very much." Eliza smiled. She said, "Good. We will draw up papers next week. Now let us celebrate with some of that excellent bread you make." Years passed. Margaret and Eliza ran the boarding house together until Eliza got too sick to work. Margaret took care of her until she died peacefully in her sleep at age 72. True to her word, Eliza left the boarding house to Margaret. It became known as the best place to stay in Flagstaff. Margaret hired good people to help her. She made sure to hire some who were down on their luck and needed a second chance. She never turned away anyone who was hungry. There was always bread and soup for those who needed it. Margaret never married again. People asked why, and she would just say she was content as she was. The truth was that no one she met ever made her feel the way Dakota had. Not romantic love exactly, but something deeper. A connection that crossed all the boundaries that society put up. A recognition of shared humanity in a world that tried to deny it. She thought about him often and wondered if he was still alive. She hoped he was. She hoped he had found some peace in Mexico or wherever he had ended up. She heard news sometimes about the Apache. The wars finally ended. The people were settled on reservations. Their children were taken to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own language. It was a kind of slow death of a culture. Margaret did what little she could. She donated money to groups that tried to help. She spoke up when people said hateful things about Indians. It was not much, but it was something. One day, about 10 years after she had last seen Dakota, a young Apache woman came to the boarding house. She wore white woman's clothes and spoke perfect English. She asked for Margaret by name. When Margaret came down, the woman said, "I am looking for the woman who knew my uncle Dakota." Margaret's heart jumped. She said, "I knew him." "Is he all right?" The woman said, "He died 2 years ago in Mexico. But before he died, he told me about you. He said if I ever came north I should find you and tell you that you were right. Friendship is possible even when everything says it should not be. The woman continued. She said, my name is Kay. My mother was Dakota's sister. She died on the march to the reservation, but before she died she made a pouch with beads on it. Dakota kept it safe for years. Before he died he gave it to me and said to bring it to a woman named Margaret Hayes who makes bread. He said you would understand what it meant. The young woman pulled out the leather pouch. It was worn and faded, but Margaret recognized it immediately. It was the one Dakota had given her all those years ago. She had left it behind at her cabin when the soldiers came. Margaret took the pouch with shaking hands. She said, how did he get this back? Kay said he went back to your cabin after the fighting ended. It was burned, but he searched through the ashes and found it. He carried it with him always. He said it reminded him that there was still good in the world. Margaret could not stop the tears. She said, thank you for bringing this to me. Kay said, there is more. Dakota wanted you to have these. She handed Margaret a small cloth bundle. Inside were seeds, Apache corn seeds like the ones Dakota had tried to teach her about years ago. Kay said he said to tell you to plant these and think of him. He said to tell you that seeds survive even when everything else burns. He said you would know what that meant. Margaret did know. It meant that hope survives, that connection survives, that the small moments of kindness and friendship plant seeds that can grow even in the harshest soil. She said, will you stay for dinner? I would like to hear more about your uncle. Kay smiled. She said, I would like that. They talked long into the night. Kay told stories about Dakota that Margaret had never heard, about how he had become a teacher in Mexico helping Apache children learn to read and write, about how he had worked to preserve the old songs and stories, about how he had never forgotten the land of his birth even though he could never return. Margaret told Kay about the morning she had been making bread and how Dakota had heard her humming. She told her about their friendship and the things they had learned from each other. Kay listened with tears in her eyes. Before Kay left the next morning, Margaret gave her a bag of her best bread. She said, your uncle told me once that breaking bread together was important. I am glad we could do that. Kay said, me too. She hesitated, then said, you loved him, did you not? Not like a wife loves a husband, but in another way. Margaret said, yes. I loved him as a friend and as a teacher and as someone who showed me a different way of seeing the world. Kay said he felt the same about you. He told me once that knowing you gave him hope that peace might be possible someday. Maybe not in his lifetime, but someday. After Kay left, Margaret planted the corn seeds in a garden behind the boarding house. She tended them carefully and they grew strong and tall. Every year she saved seeds from the harvest and planted them again. The corn became famous in Flagstaff. People would ask where she got such good seeds and she would just say they were a gift from a friend. She never told the whole story. Some things were too precious to share with people who might not understand. Margaret lived to be 80 years old. She saw Flagstaff grow from a small town to a real city. She saw cars replace horses and electric lights replace candles. She saw the world change in ways both good and bad. But through it all, she kept making bread. She kept humming the song her grandmother had taught her. She kept the leather pouch in a special place, and she kept planting the corn seeds every spring. These things connected her to Dakota and to that morning long ago when everything had changed. Near the end of her life, a young writer came to interview her about the history of Flagstaff. He asked her what was the most important thing that had ever happened to her. Margaret thought about her answer carefully. Then she said, once I made friends with someone I was supposed to see as an enemy. It taught me that the lines we draw between people are not as solid as we think. It taught me that kindness matters more than anything else. The writer did not understand, but he wrote down what she said anyway. When Margaret died, they found her journal in her room. It was filled with drawings of plants and notes about the desert and stories about her life.